Good afternoon, everyone. As Katie indicated, I'm the provost of the university, which gives me kind of the academic side of the house. I get the faculties and the research office and the research postgraduates. And, you know, for my joy, I actually am part of the celebration of our State of the Land series, which is a connection, sharing our research, both our excellence, our new professors, but also this engagement with the community, the Vibe series. This Vibe session is our also part of our Return to Campus Week. So you'll see that we actually have students on campus. They've just returned. Last week was O week. This week they're actually in classes. Reality is hitting home as we speak. I think tomorrow is going to be a big celebration as well. But this series really is the celebration, the engagement with peers across the land-based sectors to share ideas and learn about each other. For Lincoln University, it's an important way to link our research and our expertise with others, the people and organizations that make our partnerships to make a difference on the ground, create new collaborations and insights for the benefit of all Aotearoa. Today's Vibe session is Navigating New Currents, Freshwater Science and Policy in Action. We're also excited that this week we reconnect and celebrate the talent and showcase our work. While this is the final event for this week, and many of you would have been there before, as Katie indicated, we have display boards out in Waimare's foyer. We note that those will remain until tomorrow afternoon, so please take a look at the exciting work that has been done for the last year, and take a gander, identify who you might want to talk to later. It'd be really nice to reach out and make sure that the academics are aware that their research is making an impact and is meaningful. To start tonight, I'd like to introduce Dr. Izzy Barrett from Lincoln University. Izzy is one of our academics in the Waterways Research Center, which is a joint research center with University of Canterbury. Izzy is a freshwater ecologist focused on practical solutions for river and stream restoration. She develops monitoring programs that communities, landowners, and students can actually use, taking freshwater science out of the lab and putting it into action where it matters most. Today, she'll also provide us a snapshot of what Lincoln is offering and undertaking in this space. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Izzy Barrett.
Kia ora koutou. No mai haere mai ki te whare wānanga o Aoraki. My name is Izzy Barrett and I am a senior lecturer in river restoration here at Lincoln. And today, as Chad says, I have been given the opportunity to tell you very quickly about some of the work that we do here at Lincoln in freshwater science. So here at Lincoln, we are tackling the big issues in freshwater management. We're tackling them head on. The challenges in this space are pretty complex and require quite careful balancing of competing priorities. Now, the best solutions that we can find are going to be integrated and interdisciplinary. And that is where the Waterways Centre comes in. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Waterways Centre. We are a centre for applied research and teaching, and we span both universities, the University of Canterbury and Lincoln University. Some of the key faces that you'll find here at Lincoln are up there, and some of the key areas of expertise that we cover are ecology, ecologist, planning, geospatial analysis, political science and governance. So there's so many different facets of freshwater science that we cover here, which makes it a pretty exciting place to be. And our work spans lots of different freshwater systems as well. So personally, I'm focused mostly on flowing water. There's also people working on lakes and even the water that we can't see, which is particularly important because that's often the water that we're drinking, the groundwater. So the research that we're doing, we really try to ground that in local connections. And that means fostering meaningful relationships with iwi, with landowners, with farmers, local residents, and people who are just using the environment in general. And this is recognizing the real power that you can gain from local knowledge in helping to shape research, and really bringing people along the entire journey. Based here at Lincoln, we also have access to a lot of different freshwater systems, spanning some pretty exciting environmental gradients. So we've got the hills, we've got the mountains not too far away. We've also obviously got the sort of more intensively managed century plains, and also increasingly urbanized systems as well. So we have these really exciting systems to study on a local scale that give us really interesting global insights. But it's not all about getting those fancy, high impact journal articles in fancy journals. A lot of what we do as well is working with communities and getting that knowledge out there, sharing knowledge, gaining new knowledge. There's a couple of projects that I've sort of drawn some photos from here. There is one working with students along the Waikato-Selwyn River. So we've got kids out there identifying invertebrates from the Selwyn. Really good at identifying invertebrates, those kids. It's very impressive. Put me to shame sometimes. And then also a project working with Te Tamutu Runanga out near Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. I figured it would be remiss to not mention the teaching that we do, because I think this is one of the main spaces that we get a lot of impact, really inspiring future generations, even if they're not going to become freshwater scientists, giving people an awareness of freshwater science and the issues in this space. So we have teaching at an undergraduate level and master's level, and also research students, both master's and PhD, in the Waterways Centre. So there's a lot going on. It's all quite exciting. I'm happy to chat afterwards in more detail if you would like.
Thanks, Izzy. Very nice overview of what we do here at Lincoln in the freshwater space. Next, we have Dr. Andrew Dark, Technical Director at Aqualinc. Andrew is a water resource engineer with 20 years of experience working across New Zealand. He combines science and policy to support councils, communities, and developers with practical, evidence-based solutions to freshwater challenges. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Dark.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. As demand for water and land use intensification has ramped up over the years, particularly over the past few decades, the policies that are designed to protect the environment and manage increasingly scarce resources have had to evolve. So development of water allocation policy ideally wants to keep pace with change or get ahead of it even. And that has relied to a large extent on research and research-based consultancy at the science policy interface in the fields of water science and water resource engineering, including hydrology and hydrogeology. I think it's important to note at the outset that science and policy are two quite distinct fields. And there's this really important work that happens at the interface that's necessary, it's important work. But once the science is done, there's still work required to turn that into policy and rules that can be implemented and monitored appropriately. So you'll note that I mentioned both science and engineering. The team at Aqualinc come from both science and engineering backgrounds. And a lot of what we do sits somewhere on the spectrum between science and engineering. We're not doing detailed design for construction projects or asset management. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about today fits under the description of hydrological systems engineering, applying scientific principles to understand how hydrological systems respond to stresses that are created by the use of water for social and economic benefits, and how best to manage those systems and doing so create useful outcomes for water management policy development. Really important aspect of hydrological systems engineering and in the context of water allocation policy is the ability to simulate the effectiveness and the effects of different policy options. So it's a try before you buy, in other words. And two areas where Aqualinc has made a significant contribution to water management research in New Zealand over the past 2 decades, both simulation of the soil plant atmosphere system with a focus on simulating water demand and irrigation, and also simulation of the effects of water takes and irrigated land use on groundwater systems and connected surface water bodies. So in terms of the effects on the hydrological systems, this sort of modelling gives us information on changes to flows and water levels. And in terms of the water users that are getting the benefit of that water, we can get information on how supply reliability might change under different policy settings and under varying current and future climates. So this afternoon I'm going to talk about 2 strands of applied research work, and both of these are funded by the Ministry of Primary Industries. These two strands of work provide examples of the 2 types of simulation modelling that I've mentioned on the last slide. And they're both aiming to improve the implementation of current policy settings and also exploring options for new types of water allocation policies. My main focus is going to be on 2 current projects that are underway at present, but there's some important prior context going back almost 2 decades and showing how investment in this type of applied research can have a significant impact over time. But both of these work streams are focused on water quantity, but it's also really important to note that there are close and inextricable links between water quantity and water quality. You can't really get one right without having the other right. One of the really significant steps forward in water allocation policy, and particularly in Canterbury in the early 2000s, was the concept of annual allocation limits on groundwater consents. Prior to this, the consents would specify an instantaneous rate of take, perhaps a weekly volume, and that was as far as the resource consent conditions would go. If the council had set allocation limits for aquifers, then the calculation of whether an aquifer was under-allocated or over-allocated relied on the use of a rule of thumb, such as this take is going to be pumped for 30 weeks over an irrigation season, which wasn't very precise. So a database of reasonable water use volumes was initially developed for Canterbury in the early 2000s on the basis of modelling the soil moisture balance using a 40-year climate record in a daily simulation using Aqualinc's irrigation simulation. It's called Irricalc. Then in 2014, Aqualinc and Irrigation New Zealand collaborated on a project with funding from MPI's Sustainable Farming Fund, as it was known at the time, and some co-funding from the local government to produce a national database of modelled irrigation water use volumes. And that's hosted on the mycatchment.info website. And this allows a user to go into the website, select a location, select a crop type, pull in a soil type from the database that sits in behind it, select an irrigator type, and it will tell you the modelled irrigation demand volume in a 9 out of 10 dry year. So having this nationwide database of reasonable water use requirements, which accounts for this variation in climate, soils, land use, and so on, was a really major step forward. And a number of regional councils around New Zealand use this data set as part of their resource consent process. However, over time, as the amount of water meter data that is available to us has increased, it has become fairly obvious that there isn't always a good match between the measured water use and the modelled water use. So we have a current project called Next Generation Irrigation Demand Management Tools, funded through MPI's Sustainable Food and Fibre Futures Fund, SFFF, with co-funding from a number of the regional councils. And this is exploring and addressing the issue of the mismatch between measurements and modelling. We're aiming to better understand what is driving those differences between measured and modelled water use, and understanding what those drivers are will allow us to improve the accuracy and the scope of the reasonable water use database, and narrow that gap and improve the information that's available for water users and regulators. So our approach for this project includes upgrading the underlying model behind IrriCalc, the irrigation simulation software, reviewing and updating all of the input data sets, and then drilling down into what is driving those differences between the measured and modelled water use through analysis, modelling, and direct engagement with irrigators, with the water users. And at the same time, we'll be future-proofing the database and the associated web app, so that over time it becomes easier to incorporate improvements to the modelling and incorporate future climate data as it becomes available. So as part of this work, we've obtained a large data set of measured water use data from regional councils. This covers a spread of locations and crop types. And for each resource consent that we have a measured water use record for, we've analysed that against the equivalent modelled water use, and then looked at the ratio of measured to modelled use and classified that. The analysis has shown that across most crop types, the maximum measured water use is moderately to significantly lower than the maximum measured water use is moderately to significantly lower than the modelled water use for the majority of water users. And this confirms what we've been hearing anecdotally. The exception to this trend seems to be for grapes. So we're currently starting to dig into why that is. The original IrriCalc irrigation model is based on a bucket water balance approach, so that the model tracks the soil moisture and accounts for rainfall and irrigation into the top of the soil, evapotranspiration out, and rules that are based on soil moisture determine when the model applies irrigation. If the capacity of the bucket is exceeded, in other words, we overfill the soil's water holding capacity, then that excess water is assumed to drain vertically through the soil profile under gravity. And for a large proportion of New Zealand's irrigated land, this conceptual model and its underlying assumptions are perfectly valid. What we have found, though, is that in some areas, in some cases, the plant's roots are deep enough to reach the underlying water table. So this is particularly for tree and vine crops, and particularly in areas where there is a shallow water table. And in that case, the actual irrigation water requirements can be significantly less than the modelled requirements because some of that demand is being met by water from below rather than rainfall and irrigation from above. So we're developing an alternative model, which is a finite volume implementation of Richard's equation, which is actually modelling the water flow through the variably saturated soils rather than just treating the soil as a bucket that fills up and empties. So this model can handle the upwards flux of water from the water table, and we believe it will result in more realistic water demand estimates in these situations where the current model potentially isn't performing well. One of the other potential sources of variance between measured and modelled water use is the rainfall and potential evapotranspiration data that is used to drive the model. The current database values are based on interpolated rainfall and evapotranspiration from the virtual climate station network that was produced by NIWA, now Earth Sciences New Zealand. And we're currently in the process of systematically comparing alternatives to that data set with a focus on improving both the accuracy and the spatial resolution in the current 5K by 5K grid, which does cause a few issues, particularly with gradients at the top of the plains or in valleys where 5Ks from a valley floor might take you to a hillside, for example, where the rainfall patterns might be quite different. So moving on to the second work stream now. While it was a significant step forward to develop the reasonable water demand volume estimates and then apply these to resource consents as annual volume limits for groundwater takes, and while the work underway to refine those estimates to ensure that they remain robust and relevant is really important, there is evidence to suggest that those limits alone are not sufficient to prevent very low flows and lowland stream systems that are connected to the groundwater system. Now, this is in part because the current policy approach does not typically consider the state of the water resource unless you're very close to a stream and deemed to be directly hydrologically connected. And this problem is quite well illustrated by the flow record for the Selwyn River. So this is measured flows at Coesford, just a few kilometres down the road from here. And over time, over recent years, the Selwyn River has experienced extremely low flows on a number of occasions, particularly 2017 when the river was close to drying up at Coesford. And these flows have on occasion been well below the minimum flow that has been set to protect waterway health. That's the red line on the graph. And also below the 1 in 10 year annual low flow statistic, which is the black dotted line on the graph. Now, because the water users that have consent conditions linked to surface flows will have already stopped taking water at the point when the river comes down below the minimum flow, we know that direct or highly connected water takes aren't the cause of these extreme low flows. And through hindcast modelling simulations, we can show that the cumulative effect of groundwater abstraction on the plains is part of the cause of this. We'll go into more detail on this later. Now, as I mentioned before, there's this really close link between water quantity and water quality. So when you have extreme low flows like that happening in lowland streams, that compounds the water quality issues and creates these rather headline grabbing situations. So this is an image that was, I think, front page of the Christchurch Press in 2017. So in a nutshell, the problem is that current water allocation policy hasn't responded effectively to current climate variability, and the situation is expected to get even more challenging with future climate. In 2020, Aqualinc was funded by MPI through the Sustainable Land Management and Climate Change Program, SLAMIC, to explore water allocation policy options that would potentially do a better job of responding to climate variability and future climates. We did this by simulating the application of different policy options in an integrated groundwater surface water model of the Canterbury Plains, focusing on the Selwyn District Plains, using modelled climate and river flow inputs from 1972 right through to 2100, and looking at how the hydrological system responded and what those alternative allocation policy options under future climates might mean for water supply security for groundwater users. We started off that project thinking about a range of policy options. So broadly, there are two levers that can be pulled to change the drivers or the pressures of the groundwater system. You can reduce abstraction or increase recharge. We were focusing on options that reduce demand for abstraction. Reducing the annual volume, either as a blanket reduction applied to all users in all years, or a variable reduction in response to the current state of the aquifer or surface water bodies, had already been tested to some extent in previous work. And while it has some benefit for flow regimes, the problem is that unless the limit is very, very restrictive, so overly restrictive on the water users, the effect of it eventually kicking in once the water user has exhausted their annual volume limit is often too little too late to have any significant benefit for stream flows. So we then looked at restricting the daily rate of take for groundwater users based on the previous year's aquifer recharge. And we found that while this was a bit more effective, it occasionally didn't prevent the extreme low flows in the model scenarios. And that, I think, was due to the occasional mismatch between what might happen in one previous year, which causes low recharge and low groundwater levels, and what might happen in the following year, which might cause lower stream flows. So the policy option that we landed on as being most effective in this project restricts the proportion of all of the groundwater takes based on current surface water flows. In order to set the proportions of each groundwater take that would be subject to restrictions, we simulated the effect of additional water takes at various locations and depths on the plains. We looked at the effect that additional pumping would have on flows in the Selwyn River. So if you pump an additional 100 litres a second here, and that shows that there's 100 litres a second difference in the river flow, that means there's a direct 100% connection between the water take and the stream flow. So we ended up with a restriction regime that was divided into 3 aquifer depth ranges, 3 zones of the plains, and to some extent also depended on the lateral distance from the river. So for shallow water takes close to the river, this is very consistent with the current policy settings for hydraulically connected groundwater. And as you get further away and deeper, you have a lower proportion of the groundwater take that is at risk of being restricted each season. And then the actual implementation of that restriction depends on the surface water flows in the river on any given day. And this was the modelled effect on river flows of implementing that policy in our model. So these are now modelled flow hydrographs for the Selwyn River. And the 3 lines on the hydrograph are the modelled status quo in green. So you can see that in 2017, the model has done a good job of replicating the extreme low flows that are seen in the measured flow record. The model natural flow is the top line in blue. And this is what the model predicts the river would look like with absolutely no groundwater extraction on the plains. In between the two, the effect of the the adaptive policy option is in brown. So by implementing that policy in our model, we were effectively splitting the difference between the current situation and the natural flow regime, which is a significant improvement in the river flow regime. It's alleviated the very, very low flows that were seen in 2016, 2017. On the other side of the coin, the adaptive allocation policy option would have a significant impact on security of supply for groundwater users. So that these water users are currently on supplies that are close to 100% reliable. And in a very dry year, they might reach their ending volume limit, and that might mean they have to stop irrigating sooner than they might like to. But majority of the time, they can take 100% of the groundwater that they need. So under this model policy option, depending on the depth and the location of the take, some groundwater users would see really significant reductions in water availability, and that would be sufficient to threaten the viability of the current irrigated land uses. And it also forecloses on the option to transition over time to higher value land uses that people might want to move to in the future. So through that work, we had been able to design an allocation methodology that was effective in dealing with variability in the current climate and projected future change. And it did a better job of protecting flow regimes in the current policy settings. But this would have a significant economic impact on rural businesses in the case study area and the communities that depend on those rural businesses. So to address this tension between the environment and the economy, we're currently working on a project called Groundwater Resilience Solutions, also funded by MPI's SLAMIC program. And in this project, we're seeking out optimized solutions that attempt to balance these tensions between improving stream flows and maintaining agricultural production. So that this project is a collaboration between Aqualinc, Earth Science of New Zealand, the Agribusiness Group, and Aotearoa. And we also have stakeholder input from Elizabeth Sustainable Agriculture, Central Plains Water, and ECAM. Our overall approach for this work is to run case study based models in areas where there are tensions between irrigation water use and stream health. We're exploring adaptation solutions that can potentially resolve the reduction in supply reliability that's caused when allocation policy options such as the ones that we came up with in the Agile Adaptive Allocation project are applied. And I'll go into more detail on the adaptation solution shortly. So that this modelling is being pulled together into a hydroeconomic modelling framework with a mod flow groundwater model, or integrated groundwater surface water model at its core. And we're exploring using a multi-criteria optimization under uncertainty methodology. In other words, we're setting up the model to be able to do the hard work and find, in terms of being able to find the best solution or combination of solutions, rather than the project team needing to drag scenarios and then test and irrigate and test and iterate. Sorry, Freudian slip with irrigate rather than iterate there. So we're currently working on a Canterbury Plains case study. Key reasons for choosing this case study area were that we have the existing groundwater surface water model of the area that's been developed and refined and improved over the past 20 years. And also in the lowland part of this area, we have lowland streams, particularly around the western side of Te Waiwara, such as Te Waitekawai, that are particularly culturally significant streams. And there's a high level of desire from Taumata Runanga to protect the flow regimes in those streams and the ecological and cultural health that's associated with the flow regime. We initially started off looking at a much smaller area for this case study, and then expanded that out to the area shown on the map based on stakeholder feedback regarding the need to incorporate what happens on the upper plains that affects flows and levels on the lower plains. So in the upper plains area, we've got the effects of central plains water and deep abstraction. So the groundwater model in its base form extends north to the Aotearoa River and Christchurch City, but we've trimmed that down and focused on this smaller area to ensure the optimisation process is computationally feasible, because we're essentially going to be running many runs in the model and looking for the optimal solution out of that. So for the current study, we've reworked the model boundary conditions, recalibrated the model for this smaller area, and we've set it up in a way that allows us to vary the bore depths, the abstraction rates, and the land surface recharge to represent the adaptation options. So we've worked through the range of tools and solutions that are available as adaptation options. These include deepening bores potentially to reduce the level of connection to surface water, although it has already been done to some extent, or to a large extent, in the case study area. There's storage, both on-farm ponds or community scale on plains storage, or bulk water supply schemes, such as the storage that was originally proposed as being part of the Central Plains scheme. Land use change potentially reduces the rates and volumes required for irrigation for the equivalent area. And then there's potential other water sources. We already have irrigation from the Rakai River in the case study area. And then there's also the option for wetlands or other nature-based solutions and direct stream augmentation. For each of these tools or solutions, we've assessed the unit cost associated with them. For example, drilling costs per metre for deepening bores, or storage costs per cubic metre of water stored. For assessing the cost of water storage, a key part of that equation is the volume of water that's required per irrigated hectare to give you the level of supply reliability that's needed. We've investigated the volumes required, and part of this has been exploring the scenario of whether on-farm or on-plain storage can allow us to reduce the peak rate of abstraction from groundwater while still maintaining the on-farm system capacity and the on-farm water supply reliability. So it's buffer storage essentially. So the graph on the screen is showing that a relatively modest storage volume within the case study area would allow the peak abstraction rate to potentially be reduced by 40 to 50%. But then there's a turning point on that graph where larger reductions would see a significant increase in storage requirements. To assess the potential economic impacts of lower supply reliability on financial performance, our collaborators from the agribusiness group have updated some economic response functions that were originally developed in 2018 for a project on allocation economics for the Ministry of the Environment. The response functions show the relationship between farm earnings before interest and tax and water supply reliability for combinations of location on the plains, soil type, and land use. And then we can fit regression equations to those data points, and that gives us functions that can be built into the hydroeconomic model. The higher value land uses, the cut fruit and grapes shown on the graph there, are more sensitive to changing supply reliability in absolute dollar terms, but probably similar in percentage terms to the other land uses that are shown. While these impacts don't really look that massive on the graph, it's important to remember that this is a shift in the average. So it's the shift in the really badly performing financial years that is driving that shift in the average. So to pull all this together into the hydroeconomic framework, we've developed Python scripts that sit alongside ModFlow. ModFlow is the groundwater model, and test the parameter estimation software that drives the optimization process. And these scripts tie everything together to the hydroeconomic framework that can be run through the optimization process. So this allows the model to step through and evaluate the effectiveness of a particular combination of allocation policy and adaptation options. Look at how effective that is in terms of both the flow regime, the freshwater habitat, and the economic impact. Within the groundwater model, the adaptation options can typically be implemented by making changes to either the abstraction or the land surface recharge inputs. For example, if we're changing from groundwater supplied irrigation to supplying water from an alpine river and bulk storage, that removes the groundwater pumping component out of the model, but the land surface recharge related to that irrigated land area remains. Pumping groundwater to on-farm storage, that can reduce the peak abstraction rate. The recharge would remain the same in that case, but the timing and magnitude of the pumping changes. And if a pond is big enough to cover a substantial proportion of one of the model cells, you could account for the reduction in land surface recharge, assuming the pond is well lined to retain the water in it. So this project is at the point of setting up and running the Canterbury optimization case study. We'll be working through that with stakeholders to refine the parameters of the optimization process, the objectives, the constraints, the variables, and then working through the outputs and iterating as necessary before commencing a second case study in Hawke's Bay with slightly contrasting hydrology and contrasting land use. So to conclude on recapping some of the key points, simulation modelling of water resource systems allows us to test water allocation policy options before implementation, including testing the effectiveness of that implementation under future climates. This can reveal limitations of policy effectiveness and highlight trade-offs that need to be made between economics and the environment, or any adverse outcomes that need to be managed. A systems approach is really crucial for this type of work, considering the potential impacts or benefits of policy options, both on the hydrological systems and the ecosystems that they support, and the economy and the communities that supports. Water allocation policy needs to evolve, adapt, and be updated over time, and so does the science and the engineering to support this. And it's really important to have ongoing sources of funding to make that happen. Thank you. I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thanks, Andrew. We're more than happy to take some questions. I'm sure that Andrew would be happy to answer them. So, anybody? Yeah.
What portion of farmers are actually monitoring soil moisture? I mean, all those who take irrigation, are they obliged to have soil monitoring moisture equipment? Because I've been on bases where I've seen farmers irrigating, and I know that that they haven't got a water deficit, and so I wonder how, if it's not mandatory.
At present, it's not mandatory. So it's mandatory to measure your water take. It's not mandatory to measure your soil moisture.
Yeah.
There are an increasing number of farmers who are installing soil moisture monitoring in order to improve the grade they get through their farm and audit process. But there's always the question about whether they're actively engaging with that data, or whether they're just installing the equipment to tick a box, get the paperwork through, and then not really taking much notice.
Yeah, because I know farmers are very reluctant to give up. If they'll use that water if they can, because they don't want to give it up or to be seen not to be using their full consent. And so you're dealing with sociology, social science should be there, because they, there's a temptation to kind of use their full allocation and not to give it up to anybody else,
Oh, absolutely.
And so, there's some efficiencies I'm sure to be gained there. But just following on from that, so I mean, I assume that bulk water storage has been talked about, but only probably been some of the bigger farms have actually, put these types of, dams and stuff into store water. Is it becoming more common?
Well, when I say bulk water storage, I'm talking about the likes of Lake Coleridge.
Oh, that's exactly right. Okay.
Large dams in the foothills.
Right.
Potentially some of the larger community scale on plain storage that has been planned and has been developed to a certain extent. But the on-farm storage potentially gets us into a trap of thinking that we've got the water storage problem sorted in Canterbury. But when you look at the volume that those on-farm ponds represent in total, I don't think it's enough to get us through a really severe drought.
Right.
What was the impact on the Central Plains Water Scheme on groundwater demand?
Groundwater has reduced, and particularly some of the very deep pumping that's happening on the upper plains. It's more economic for those water users to be supplied with schemes than to pump from very great depths with all the power consumption that's associated with that. So I don't know the actual numbers, but yes, there has been a reduction in groundwater use since Central Plains came online.
Any other questions?
Good comment there. Again, you've spoken before about minimum flows. There's been discussion recently in the paper about the Rakaia, whether that's while there are flushing flows in spring and maybe over the winter, whether the ecology has been changed because there's not sufficient flow over, through summer months as well, or there's a need for that. I don't know, is the science looking at, we're capable of spending more, looking at, we talk about the minimum flows, but obviously the ecology and maintaining that is quite important. And I just wonder if, whether that could be a potential issue for some of our graded rivers.
Absolutely. I think there will be a push to review and potentially raise minimum flows in a lot of rivers around New Zealand, and that in itself has potentially quite severe implications for water supply reliability for existing water users, and it does sort of push you down the path of alternative water sources or water storage to mitigate that change in reliability.
Just the multi-criteria optimization, I didn't quite catch all the levers that are involved in that optimization. I think so. Storage, boring.
So the options available are deepening bores to change the depth of the abstraction, water storage, alternative water sources, alternative land uses, or direct targeting of the issue through stream augmentation, potentially strategic retirement of pieces of land.
And the opportunity for simulation is fantastic. What level of uptake by policy in terms of actually changing policy have you seen? And then what is the social acceptability of relying on simulation modeling?
With the irrigation water requirements modelling that I talked about towards the beginning of the presentation, there has been a large degree of uptake of that work, and that has been quite well accepted by councils and by water users. But as I was talking about, there has been this this feeling creeping in that maybe the modelling isn't quite right, and that's why we're going back, trying to improve and update that as we've got more data to work with, potentially better tools.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, if there are no further questions, please join me in thanking. Apologies.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, just the looking at the upgraded rivers and the relationship of the groundwater and how it's recharged, you know, the connection. Have you explored the nature-based solutions with the grey claim to of wetlands and that sort of thing? Is there any exploration and nature-based?
There's not really something that I've explored in these projects. I know Scott Wilson and others from Lincoln Agritech have done a lot with the Bradford aquifers and trying to understand how that all works. And yeah, I don't know if Scott has tied that into nature-based solutions or not at this stage.
Again, please join me in thanking both Andrew and Izzy for their talks today. And Andrew, we do have a token of our appreciation. So thank you very much. And please join us for some drinks and cutting out in the foyer and enjoy the posters as well. Thank you. Thanks.